give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it? So today we really wanted to start talking about one of the critical issues that has been at the forefront of a lot of news for the last 100 days, and that is that of what's going on across the waters
Mm-hmm.
in how we might define it as Palestine, Israel, and definitely we know that it is Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
So, welcome to this conversation.
Yes. Well, I'm curious, Jay, how I think you've expressed to me before that you're not a big news watcher. And so I'm curious because I've been, for lack of a better term, been saturating myself with it. So I'm curious what you've been hearing, since you're not a person that, you don't consume the news intentionally a lot.
Mhm.
So I'm curious how it's been showing up for you, where you've been hearing about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. So I have been receiving information about what's going on in Gaza through conversations, and then a lot of the different type of publications that I have subscribed to via my email. So
Mhm.
reading a lot of discourse and different perspectives that people are coming into this conversation and struggling through how it is that we can be existing in this moment when we know that genocides are happening, this genocide being on the forefront. And I would be remiss if we weren't naming the other genocides that are not getting the same amount of attention, which also speaks into the dynamics of what we're talking about when we're having conversations about what white supremacy looks like, what value looks like, what humanity looks like in this moment. And so speaking into what's actually happening in Gaza, but also honoring and naming that the same types of genocides are happening in the Congo, that they're happening in Sudan, that they've been happening in Myanmar. And then there's other places that we are not getting the information about. So if you are connected to whatever you're connected in your algorithm
Yeah.
that's coming through, and we're in a moment and a time where that algorithm is really self-serving. So I'm also getting a lot of perspectives on what it is that I'm aligned with, and I do try to diversify that by having an opportunity to look at um, a more expanded view of how people are coming into this conversation. I was just recently in New York at a convening, and one of my colleagues was asked to say a few words and got up to say a few words. And in this moment, there is a hesitation about how much, especially if you're a person from a marginalized community and you're in need of resources, or you're in need of maintaining your job, or you're in desire to be able to have your perspective amplified in some amplified. Oops, sorry about that. Amplified on some platform. I'm hesitant about how much you want to speak into what your belief system is about what's happening in regards to the genocide. And so one of my friends, colleagues, spoke into it during their presentation, and afterwards was accountable enough to realize that some people might have been impacted by the language. And so that person decided to go up to one of the people that they observed might have been impacted. And the responsiveness was, I hear your position, but I want you to also be in consideration of my position and the impact, and at least speak into that when it is that you're having a general conversation about what your belief system is. And so one was that we're recognizing and we're seeing a genocide that has really lasted 30 years since the Oslo Pact was signed. I don't know what the actual technological, I mean, the specific
The
words of that
1948.
act was.
Yeah.
Yeah. That we've been watching what we experienced in the creation of the United States, right? A manifest destiny, a taking over of a land and a placement, and then believing that there was a right to be able to do that. Um, and then also acknowledging that there's a people that is lost, that have been wandering and wanting to have a rooted space. And how do you do that? How do we do that in coexisting with one another? And we're really talking about what the state of Israel is in the land of Palestine and the conflict amongst those two people, but then also the conflict amongst each of the people from their respective communities. And so here today, and I'm glad to be having this conversation with you because I always enjoy having conversations with you.
I like talking to you too.
Thanks.
Yeah, I will admit that I'm not as compassionate um as you just described for folks who are showing up in spaces with deep resonance and deep identifier with the mindset around Israel, the creation of Israel, the commanding of that land, and the right to be there, the right to control the space. I don't have as much compassion around that. I'm finding myself really struggling with now that I mean, full disclosure, October 7th was my awakening to what is happening on that in that space. I did not was not aware of what was happening there before that. So I'm late to the game. And I want to acknowledge that. Um, and I've been on a steep learning curve trying to learn about the history and learn about what has led up to this point. And I'm also finding that I can get really lost in the weeds of all of that. And then I try to rise up above all of that. It's complicated talk and just say, you know what? Almost 30,000 people have lost their lives in the past 100 days, and that's not okay with me. And for some folks that may sound really simplistic, oh, you're not taking into account all of the history. And I don't know, I feel a sense of frustration that we can get caught in the weeds of looking at all of the minutia of it and forget that this many people, and we've been watching it on live stream. It's different than any other genocide in so far as our being able to like see what's happening on the day to day. And there are some people in my life that would probably say that I was too caught up in it and that I was saturating myself with it and that I needed to take a break and whatever. But I feel like that's from a place of really deep privilege. And I feel like it's my responsibility now that I know to accept the fact that I it's just too easy for me to ignore it. I've been ignoring it, I guess you could say, since 1948. I haven't been alive that long, but I have not been paying attention until now. So I don't think that means that I can't have an opinion on it, but sometimes I feel like people think, not sometimes, people have told me that they think I don't have the right to have an opinion on it because I just started paying attention. So, curious
Oh,
if you have any
interesting.
thoughts about that.
Yeah. Oh, you've said a couple of things that create a curiosity for me. One of them is the level of compassion. And we made a decision to have this conversation with each other. And as I'm getting closer to this actual conversation, thinking about this convening that I was at in New York City and the responsiveness and power dynamics and needing resources, um, I did start to be like, okay, if I'm coming to this conversation on something that's actually going to be documented somewhere that people can refer back to, like, how much do I want to say when we can see, like, a woman who is the president of Harvard be essentially pushed out because of her position, or we could see one of the world powers um, uh, seemingly observably being bullied into supporting inhumanity. So I do not have compassion for loss of life in any way, shape, or form. I have no compassion for that at all. I also don't have, I also don't feel like I have the same privilege to not be considerate of what the real impacts to my life could be, depending on what it is that I communicate that somebody has you know, perceives in whatever way that they perceive.
Yeah.
And so there's a reality of of a cautious conversation, and then speaking into whether or not I have the right to make comments on what's happening in Gaza. The only place that I can come to this conversation is thinking about what the impacts of what's happening in Gaza looks like for me in real time
Mhm.
on US soil.
Mhm.
And so when I'm thinking about Gaza, I'm thinking about it as a real social experiment on what's acceptable for people from marginalized communities,
Mhm.
and what the powers that be are willing to do, to be able to have what they believe that they're entitled to,
Mhm.
and the realities of the fallout and the ripple effects from that.
Mhm.
And so I come into this conversation thinking about it in that way, and thinking that I have the expertise of my experience to speak into how I've experienced and seen this similarly when we're thinking about the history of the creation of, you know, or the transformation of Turtle Island, the United States, into the United States, and what that meant for the people that were here, for this idea of manifest destiny um, was developed, created, and uh, what the impacts of that has been in the last 400 years of for almost 500 years of this country, and its
That's
development
something
and
that
its power.
Yeah, and that's something that has come up for me and my awareness over the course of the past few weeks was that we're watching in real time an example of what happened in this country that my ancestors propagated and perpetrated onto the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island when they landed on the shores of this country and put their flag down and said, there's nobody living here, and the people that do live here are savages. So let's just take all the land because look, nobody's going to fight us on it. We're seeing that happen in real time, and for other folks like myself who come from ancestors who perpetrated that atrocity here on this land, and they're often quick to say, well, I haven't owned any slaves and I didn't do that and I didn't, because they weren't alive then. It's like, okay, well, you're alive now. And this is happening, and are you saying anything? Are you, it's not for everybody to get in the streets. I get that. I also come from the privilege of I am not currently working for an organization or an entity that would have any kind of opinion about me expressing my opinions, or that would be able to venture any kind of repercussions on me because of my beliefs. So I want to acknowledge that puts me in a different place than where other people could be, and that's very real. Like you said, we watched the president of Harvard get drummed out, and you can't tell me it's because of plagiarism. I'm sorry, I'm not buying it. That's total BS. And if she wasn't a black woman, would they have been so quick to do that? I mean, that's a
Exactly.
whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So it's multi-layered, and it's also really simple. Like,
very simple.
if we ever want to see this power structure dynamic that is played out over and over and over again for millennia, more than millennia, in our societal constructs, if we ever want to see that do something different, then we have to stand up and say, we're going to demand something different. And I'm a person that tends to subscribe to the belief system that everything happens for a reason. And I know that can be a loaded statement for some folks. because I've had pushback on me from that because people say, well, what about the victims? And, you know, I mean, I've been a victim myself of things, and I know I didn't cause the perpetration of that victimhood, but I do believe as a soul, I came in to this lifetime to learn certain lessons and signed up for what I have walked through, as unfortunate and hurtful as it was. But you know, do we want to see this pain and this? I want this to not be happening in vain. I don't want 30,000 people to have died and us learn nothing, you know, and us do nothing different. And so that's where I find that's where I find my fuel to keep talking about this and keep going in the streets and keep doing whatever it is I can do to have small discussions, big discussions, any discussions with people about what's happening there. Because if we don't, if we're never going to change it, this dynamic is just going to keep manifesting itself, and people are going to continue to be hurt and wiped off the
Yeah.
face of the world.
No, I hear you. It's happening. It's real. People
Yeah,
are dying. And the simple part of that is that should not be happening. People should not be dying
right.
over land, because there's enough land for all of us to have the accessibility of the land,
Really, truly.
and to care and love the land, and love each other as humans. Um, but that's not the reality.
No.
And there are so many more complexities. And one of the things that you brought up was becoming new to the awareness of this genocide that is taking place, that has been happening for a very long time, because this is like, I've heard stories of, one of the stories which I thought was really fascinating was somebody of Jewish faith, uh, who who is a part named themselves a part of Israel, and their experience of the bombings that was happening was that they were used to hearing it on a daily basis,
Hmm.
and their young babies were used to hearing it also. So I'm thinking about, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, I believe, were the age of the children in the stories that were used to hearing bombings as they're getting ready to go to preschool, as mama's giving them their food in the morning, a breakfast cereal. And the thing that changed for them on this particular morning, I don't have the specific date, was that the bombs were coming in closer proximity than they've ever experienced in their lives. And
Okay.
so that made them say, hey, what's going on? So these are folks that are living in the area that have normalized hearing bombing,
Hmm.
but it was never ever directed or in close proximity to where they were living. And
Right.
when they realized that it was in close proximity to where they were living, that's when they got startled. That's when they got concerned, which
Mm-hmm.
then for me was, oh, y'all are used to this bombing, but you've never seen it as a threat to yourselves, which means
Right.
it's been happening to the people that the bombs are being aimed at.
Right.
Um, and I've been aware of Palestine. I always appreciate young people because my awareness of Palestine really came with this organization called the Dream Defenders that's out here in South Florida. I'm in the South. Strong abolitionist organization of young people that came together after the killing of Trayvon Martin here in Florida. Um, have always stood as abolitionists, and a part of their platform was to bring and raise awareness, and participate in the BDS movement in regards to Palestine, because some of their founding members are of Palestinian descent.
Okay.
So they were always able to tell stories about what was going on in Palestine. And they also took excursions there every year so that people could develop a relationship with the people that lived there, both from Palestine and some folks that lived in the Israel encampments, but mostly the relationship with Palestinians. And some of the stories that I heard about these trips that I also tried to go on was that passing through checkpoints to be able to move from one area to the other of this area, And I was really impacted by this. I even developed out a workshop so people could experience what it means to have somebody tell you where you can and cannot move and have to actually go through a checkpoint. We're not used to that unless, police are looking for, guns or drugs or something like
Right.
that. And then we have a
Right.
checkpoint. And when we're going through those
DUI
checkpoints,
checkpoints or something
a
at night.
DUI
Yeah.
checkpoint,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we see those checkpoints, we get annoyed and frustrated. Oh my gosh, they're making us stop. They're, my time. And there's actually people who have been living in this way and not being able to access grandma, cousin, family member because there's a checkpoint and there is a limit to movement, which reminds me of like kind of this like dystopian future that has been visioned where certain people at a certain class level can move. And those are the things that are very present here today. Like when I heard those stories, I was just like, I can see through legislative practices and through even just the way that communities are designed that there are elements of that type of freedom of movement and limitation that government bodies are creating here on US soil. And so that made me start to really be curious about what was going on in Palestine and also um, the celebration of the level of liberation of the people of Palestinian descent who identify as Palestinian continue to push for and continue to advocate for themselves on the land of their ancestors.
Yeah.
And that's been fascinating. And then I also have another realization when my mother, who a very strong, staunch Christian person, planned to go on one of those excursions to, walk the same path of Jesus,
Okay.
and went there. And for those who are listening who can't visually see me, I'm, a Black identified woman. And so my mom going over there with one of her best friends, excited to walk the path of Jesus, in Jerusalem and see all of the things that are with the stories of the Bible. And when they got out there, having a realization that my mother described it in this way, that the brown people were being discriminated against in the same way that Black Americans are discriminated against in the US.
Mhm.
And being there on a Christian excursion and seeing that in this land was kind of like that was like taken aback. And she brought back these purses that interestingly enough are culturally Palestinian. They had Israel on them, and she,
Okay.
that was like how she gifts my daughters, her granddaughters. And when she gifted the purses, I looked at them because knowing what was happening in Palestine, and I was like, oh, okay. And they got put away somewhere in a closet because I never wanted my children to be walking out with these, you know, culturally Palestinian um, beaded purses, but they said Israel on them.
Yeah.
And and knowing the level of oppression and discrimination on people who are prescribed as brown people in a land was really very difficult. It has always been very difficult for me. And I know that you're saying that your awareness came on October 7th. What did that look like for you?
Uh, well, I mean, of course, just through Western media, I heard about the attacks on the people of Israel, and the horrors of that. Details were sketchy, everything was coming in slowly. And then, however many days later, when Israel started to retaliate, I think it was probably through social media that I started to hear voices from people in Palestine talking about and people who identified as Palestinian who no longer lived in that land, who had already been displaced and live elsewhere, either through their families being displaced in past campaigns, but slowly but surely started to hear from these voices that this has been happening, all along, and the idea that the October 7th attack, which I was hearing only through Western media, which was all about, oh, the horrors visited on the Israeli people, which, yes, 1,200 people died on October 7th in horrible ways. And I'm not minimizing that at all. And the media was talking mostly about the horrors of what happened. We heard about people being kidnapped from the music festival and the atrocities that happened there. And it was all couched in terms of, because this happened, we're doing this. And it wasn't until weeks into it, as I was listening to more of these voices from people who were actually on the front lines, that were in Gaza at the time, who were relating what was happening to them. And I remember it dawning on me that it was like, wait a minute, why are we saying that this is okay? That bombing these people just nonstop was okay. Yes, what happened on October 7th was horrible, but it was one moment in time. It was well, not one moment. I know it took a couple hours to happen, but it was a day of atrocities. And then we're seeing day after day after day after day of these bombings happening, and it felt imbalanced. It felt that it wasn't equal, I guess, because the terminology that was being used was, Israel has the right to defend itself. That's what every Western media report started with. Israel has the right to defend itself. And I'm like, that's not defense, First of all, your right to defend yourself was in the moment of October 7th when you were being attacked. That's defense. The rest of it's offense, if we're going to use traditional sports terminology. It was really mostly just listening to voices of people in Palestine and people who were Palestinian identified, but were no longer in that space, and the details of everything that had happened since 1948 started to unfold. And it just blew my understanding of all of that just wide open. I remember seeing video of some of the first Israeli hostages that were released by Hamas and were returned to their families. And one of them I recall that really deeply impacted me was of a woman who, I think she identified herself as a grandmother, so she was a person of elder age, thanking and shaking the hands of her captors before they turned her over to, as she was leaving them to go be returned to her family, thanking them for taking such good care of her. And then the spin of the Western media saying, well, she was only doing that because they still have some of her family members, and so she was afraid of them. But that's not the sense that I got when I watched her interaction with them. She was, I'm sure she didn't want to be held captive. Nobody does, but she was thanking them for taking such good care of her. And it's like all of my synapses were challenged in that moment to make sense of what I was seeing, because I'm thinking of somebody who was being held captive, being so grateful to be back with their family and running, screaming away from their captors. And that's not what I saw. And these are the little details and the little, they're not little, but just the fragments of information that have been coming into my brain as I unpack all of this stuff. It's really spoken into for me about the understanding of narrative, the understanding of who controls the story and what story do they want us to believe, and just the straight out lies that are being told and the framing. When you listen to people talk about it, it's always but Hamas. I would have conversations with people who were of Jewish faith who might identify themselves as Zionists, who would say, the first couple of 2-3 sentences they would say in any dialogue with me was, well, but do you denounce what Hamas did? And I'm like, I don't understand why I have to do that for you to even have a conversation with me about all violence is wrong. And if I'm going to denounce Hamas, are you going to denounce what Israel's been doing for the past 100 days? I mean, can we call there just seemed to be such an imbalance in what the expectation was about what people said, and how I wasn't allowed to have an opinion because I just learned about this. That really pissed me off, because I was like, I get it. I'm late to the game. I'll be the first to admit it, but that doesn't mean I can't call it what I'm seeing.
So when October 7th happened, And I did see on the news because I was like, wait, what's going on? And so you want to visualize and see the picture. So in that moment, I did turn on the news. I did see, you know, and being realistic, I was like, yeah, finally the oppressed is rising up. Like,
Yeah.
we're not going to let you do this after 30 years. We're done. We finished with this, which is also one of the fears that's like, an undertone on US soil, right? Is that
Yeah.
at some point, those who are oppressed are going to be like, enough of this.
We're done.
And,
Yeah.
and have a responsiveness that hasn't been the case in over 400 years. I mean, it's probably not like the sentiment of a majority of humans, but you do have these moments of, at some point, I'm not going to let you violate, abuse, limit my mobility, take my freedom, say that I'm a lesser human being than you. There, you do get to this place. So on October 7th, I was when visually saw what was happening on the news, and so I'm looking, but I'm not really listening because I know it's going to be full of crap. And uh, I was disheartened in my gut to the point where I couldn't watch it. Like, and I couldn't continue on with it. It was just way too difficult. It's way too difficult to go out in the streets because I feel a level of hypocrisy with that. Um, it's too difficult in my algorithm scroll to like I did try to hear what people of Jewish faith were talking about in regards to it. I even looked up some writing uh from like from I guess what people might identify as Zionist humans as to how they were having conversations about this. Like there's an actual document that says this is how, if you're going to speak on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how you should speak on it if you were being in consideration with people of Jewish faith. So I looked at those things to try to have an understanding, and for me, it just kept on coming back to those with power are going to continue to grab at their power to the harm of themselves because there's no recognition of you holding this place of power, how you're actually harming yourself because you're limiting yourself from like the fullness of life experience, and you're going to be living in fear because you've created yourself in this power structure. So it's a cycle that you're going to have to continue to hold your positionality. And when any bully, like if we're just talking about straight up street politics, any bully who goes in and takes over any type of territory is always going to be in fear of retaliation. So that you're always going to have to live on the defense, which is not a healthy way to be living.
Right.
So, all right, those are the folks in power. And then there's also those who are being oppressed, or who have been retaliated against, there is fear that's instilled in that community because you're able to see how much support those in power are getting. And so it really makes the conflict very difficult on how it is that we can get to a transformative state to find some type of solution to this violence that's happening, to this genocide that's happening. And it's disheartening. It's disheartening because living on US soil, you see that it doesn't change. Those in power hold power. That power lasts through generations of lifetimes. There's rippled effects of that. And then there's a denial of the violence and an erasure of the stories about what has occurred. And so that's what I'm sitting in real time going, generations from now, if we still exist in the way that we exist, which I'm curious as to what that's going to look like. This story is going to look different than what we are witnessing as a genocide of a group of people.
Why do I give a fuck?
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, as you move throughout your day, continue to ask yourself,
Why do I give a fuck?
Why Do I Give a Fuck is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.